Welcome, everyone. I think most of you are familiar with Docomomo, but if not, our long name stands for the Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement. And our local chapter here is partnered with the Goldstein, the Textile Center, and Ackerman Modern to put on this series of events. So we're starting here tonight at the Goldstein. I'm going to introduce our guest, Laura Ackerman-Shaw, and then we'll go into the film in tandem. So Laura Ackerman-Shaw earned her bachelor's and master's degree in English literature from Stanford University. After more than 35 years in publishing as a director of design, editorial, production, and translations, she founded Ackerman Modern to steward her parents' design legacy through exhibitions, programs, publications, and licensing. She has presented widely, including at Modernism Week and UCLA, authored numerous articles, and serves on the advisory board for the Manitoga Russel Wright Design Center. Laura is excited to release her new book, Evelyn and Jerome Ackerman, California Mid-Century Designers, which explores the Ackermans' unique contributions to post-war American design. Featuring essays by leading design historians and curators, the book includes never-before-seen drawings, photographs, and archival materials that chronicle the Ackermans' remarkable partnership and enduring influence.
I really want to thank Aidan O'Connor and the Goldstein Museum of Design for hosting today, and Stephen Magner and Peter Barilli for inviting me, and Docomomo, Minnesota, and their board for hosting this event and tomorrow. I also was not supposed to be in that film, and they swore they were not filming me. They were just getting B-roll information. So that's 10 years ago. My hair's a little bit longer, probably a lot grayer underneath. So thank you very much for all of that. And so I'd like to spend a little time today talking to you about my parents. Over their 5-decade career, Evelyn and Jerome Ackerman produced a really extraordinary range of work, including ceramics, textiles, mosaics, wood carvings, hydrostone, and metalwork. And it really combined a modernist sensibility with artisanal craftsmanship. Their designs, reflecting their fine art and their studio craft training, found favor with the interior designers, architects, and a broader public. Now, since I'm talking to a group of mid-century enthusiasts already, I don't really need to give you a lot of background on mid-century modern or its precursor, the Bauhaus, but I do want to talk a little bit about the distinctly California mid-century modern milieu in which my parents played a central role. Sorry, this is a much touchier computer than mine. Okay, so the economic and demographic changes that followed World War II really profoundly affected California, which had become a primary center of the US war-related economy. The state experienced enormous growth that led to massive increases in population, expansion of jobs, and development of urban, suburban, and industrial centers. By 1962, California surpassed New York as the most populous state, and by 1967, it was the 6th largest economy in the world. These economic and demographic shifts permanently changed the nation's regional balance, imparting on California a newfound status and independence from the East Coast. And I would say that the Golden State's burgeoning population led to profound cultural changes that popularized what were at the time radical ways of living, whether it was an indoor-outdoor house or an automobile-based city. Its temperate climate was the perfect setting for mid-century modernist design to thrive. And freed from the constraints of Europe and New York, California became its own preeminent center of design and architecture, where the Los Angeles Times referred to its residents as, quote, the design-intoxicated post-war generation. So with roots in the Bauhaus and European and East Coast modernism, the modernist aesthetic came into its own in California, where the climate and culture provided an ideal environment for it to flourish. Craft Horizons editor Conrad Brown published a special issue on California in September 1956, in which my parents were included. He proclaimed that bright colors seem brighter and warm colors warmer in that brilliant saturation of sunlight that Californians have so much right to boast about. I'm very glad I brought a California Day to Minneapolis today, by the way. Moving away from the austere, hard-edged look of its precursors, California modernism was organic, naturalistic, textural, warm, and, as you can see here, colorful. It reflected a revival of crafts and the adaptation of industrial innovations to artistic use. One of the state's major developers, Joseph Eichler, had architects who designed nearly 11,000 homes for him. This magazine article features a Claude Oakland designed Eichler styled by Matt Kahn, who did a lot of work for Joe, and includes my mother's windows tapestry, but you can also see Eames Furniture, Nelson Furniture, and Gerard Fabrics in this piece. So what set my parents on their path as designers? Neither came from artistic homes. They didn't have access to art. They never went to the Detroit Institute of Art growing up, but they both loved to draw from an early age. My dad, Jerome, who everybody called Jerry, was born in 1920. My mother, Evelyn Lipton, was born in 1924. And as you heard in the movie, they grew up just blocks apart in Depression-era Detroit, and they were enrolled in even the same schools, but they never met because of a 4-year age difference. Both enrolled at Wayne State University, where their paths crossed one time, which my mother always reminded my dad about. They then got kind of not torn apart because they hadn't really gotten together, but World War II happened. And my father left to work at a naval ordnance plant and then joined the Air Force as a control tower operator. My mother initially began at the University of Michigan, but her father passed away and her brothers enlisted, and her mother called her home. So she transferred to Wayne as a fine arts and art history major. After his discharge from the Air Force, my father lived in California as a self-described beach bum. A friend suggested he meet a beautiful woman working at this interior design studio, and Evelyn Lipton, smart and accomplished, had a bevy of beaux. But Jerry won her over with wit, charm, intelligence, and, as you heard in the movie, a Milky Way, which happened to be her favorite candy bar, by the way. Despite being opposites in personality, my father was very gregarious and outgoing, and my mother more scholarly and introverted. Their 64-year marriage reflected their singular bond, and at the heart of my parents' story is really a love affair for each other and for design. And it led to a life and a career that spanned 6 decades. Their partnership blended their complementary talents and temperaments. And my mother really summed it up well. She said, quote, "How many couples can work together and last? If I couldn't do something, he did it. If he couldn't do it, I did." So the GI Bill was really consequential to vets returning from World War II. In 1949, my father received $130 a month. Tuition, supplies, and living expenses were to be covered by that amount while he completed his college education. In 1951, he graduated with an arts education BS because he was worried he needed to be able to teach to make a living. That same year, my mother graduated with her MFA on a scholarship. Charles Harder, the chairman of the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University, was the guest juror of the Wayne Senior Art Exhibition. He was very impressed by my father's work, and he offered him a place in the prestigious Alfred Graduate Program, where my dad completed his MFA in ceramics in 1952. As married art students in 1949, my parents were inspired by an event that changed the trajectory of their shared life career. For Modern Living, the groundbreaking exhibition organized by Alexander Gerard at the Detroit Institute of Arts sought to define modernism for a broad public audience. His goal was to show that, quote, "modern design implies shape for use, simplicity, and new forms to utilize new materials." We all know he was a multi-talented designer in his own right, but Gerard curated room installations by designers of the day: Alto, Masson, Russom, Knoll, Eames, Nelson, and Van Keppel Green. In the catalog, E.P. Richardson wrote, quote, "It is very important for an art museum to show the work of modern designers. It enables us to see what is being done today in relation to what has been done. There's a flood of new ideas, nothing less than a whole new approach to the design of homes and other things we live with." And that's part of why this idea of being at the Goldstein is so appropriate, because here we talk about these two women and their impact on home and decor and everything else and how it's been brought forward. So this is a terrific fit for us. So this exhibition was a real catalyst for my parents. My father said, quote, "It opened our eyes to an exciting new way of thinking in design expression." And he said, "If the Eames can do it, why can't we?" In 1952, my parents took a leap of faith and moved to LA, where they found a creative environment conducive to experimentation, enabling them to stretch beyond these fine art backgrounds that they had. Here they saw what they called new expressions, where design, art, and craft intersected. My dad also said it was a place where they could move and not freeze their asses off. For $66 a month, they rented a space and opened Jenev Design Studio, a combination of their first names. They thought it sounded very European. They shared a belief in and a passion for the transformative power of modern design, and they had very little money, but a surplus of ingenuity, talent, tenacity, and a willingness to work really hard. My dad spent the first year designing shapes, making molds, and developing glazes for a line of slip cast pottery using the production skills he had honed at Alfred. Many were black or white or black and white because he said it went with everything. Some were decorated by my mother in sgraffito. To supplement their income, they created ceramic designs for an import company, and my mother answered fan mail for Red Skelton for $1 an hour. She also corrected all his ad libs and his scripts. Their work began to appear in local and national publications, and when mid-century furniture designer Paul McCaw began selling Jenev ceramics in his directional showrooms, they had a real breakthrough. My parents were functioning simultaneously as craftspeople, commercial designers, and producers. The designer craftsmen of this time bridged the gap between studio and factory, invoking the spirit of modernism by experimenting with and adapting new methods of production to make products more accessible. The Los Angeles Times art critic Arthur Milieu wrote, "Southern California ceramists, quote, are not overburdened by the weight of the past, but we create out of an incredibly flowering present." My parents are in this picture, kind of on the right side, holding their Jenev ceramics. There's a mosaic behind them. And they were friends with other members of the American Ceramic Society. So you can see Malcolm Leland holding a lantern ceramic, and Peter Volkus up in the top left. And Peter next to my dad is a pretty funny thing because Peter was huge and my dad was maybe 5'7". Here in Minneapolis, between 1952 and 1964, the Walker Art Center produced a series of biennial exhibitions called Fiber, Clay, Metal. During this period, it was very uncommon for art museums to feature fine craft, and the exhibitions attracted submissions from around the country, including my parents, who had ceramics in the 1953 and 1955 shows. This is my mother's bud vase from 1953, I think. In a 1954 Walker Art Center Design Quarterly, Robert Goldwater discussed aesthetics and talked about, quote, diversity, originality, freshness, and individual expression. And I think that describes my parents perfectly. So the business expanded. And in 1956, Jenev morphed into ERA Industries. My father focused on the showroom, marketing, sales, product development, and suppliers, while my mother became the primary designer. I think it's very unusual, but my mother was out there front and center in the marketing, designs by Evelyn Ackerman. She was not held as a secondary partner, which was very typical of the period. Now, despite the evolution of their roles, my parents did collaborate on every design and every business decision. And in 1963, West Coast Sourcebook noted, quote, in the case of ERA's designer owners who work so closely together, it is proper to speak of a single career. The first ERA showroom opened in 1959 on Melrose Avenue in LA, and by 1964, they outgrew it and moved to Beverly Boulevard across from Herman Miller. And that's the showroom I remember growing up in. My mother often worked at home in our studio. And they sold to the trade only. They were not retailers. They sold to architects like Gensler and Victor Gruen, Craig Elwood, William Pereira, Richard Dorman, and Charles Luckman, and interior designers like Arthur Elrod, Howard Hirsch, and Steve Chase. To better serve their clients, they didn't showcase their own designs only, they also added other craftsmen to their line in ways that complemented theirs. But my parents built their firm on more than creative alchemy. They were remarkably entrepreneurial. Not only did they build a business from scratch, but they handled every aspect from marketing to advertising to designing. Despite what people thought, ERA was a very small company. Outside of my parents, there was a person in the warehouse, a bookkeeper, and a showroom manager. They hired sales representatives to give their designs national exposure, but they didn't have something like a Herman Miller behind them. Growing up in the showroom, I saw firsthand the challenges: late shipments, quality issues, language barriers, and dwindling number of craftspeople available to produce their designs. There was a constant pressure to come up with something new all the time. So my mom was constantly designing. And of course, there were no computers to aid with design, no email or fax to communicate, no FedEx to ship products, no cell phones to snap a photo. Business was conducted via letters and phone calls, only occasionally because that was expensive. Price lists were typed on an IBM Selectric and ads were pasted up by hand. So these two advertising pieces, my dad took the photo of me in the park across the street. I was 3, and my mother did the typography and the paste ups all by hand. So I know this group is all familiar with John Intenza and Arts and Architecture. He hired Alvin Lustig to redesign the magazine, and Eames, Noguchi, Bertoya, Fallis, Saarinen, and Gary to create covers. The magazine's central focus was the modern house and its interior. The Case Study House program, which ran from 1945 to 1966, promoted architects like Koenig, Neutra, Lautner, and Elwood, who focused on aesthetic and structural approaches that embraced comfort and leisure, with open floor plans, simple volumes, and panoramic windows. My parents' designs warmed up these houses. The Julia Schulman photo you can see is Case Study House number 25, otherwise known as the Frank House, designed in 1961 by Killingsworth, Brady, and Smith. The Frank brothers was a big contemporary store in Long Beach. My parents sold to them all the time. But basically, from the mid-50s on, you would see my parents' ads or coverage of their work in Arts and Architecture, like the pieces you see on the black and white pages. Contemporary stores on the West Coast and throughout the US sold furniture and accessories designed and produced by designer craftsmen like my parents that fit into these new homes. Along with tastemakers like magazine editors, retail and department stores played a critical role in creating a customer base for my parents. Publications like Arts and Architecture, West Coast Sourcebook, Interiors, Craft Horizons, House Beautiful, Sunset, and House and Garden were important in bringing my parents' work to this national audience. But more coverage came in the LA Times Home Magazine every Sunday than through any other publication. So much so that my parents were always asked if they were on the payroll because their pieces appeared all the time. I love this stylized Schulman photo of an Arthur Elrod designed room that Arthur did all around the colors of this queen tapestry. Now, perhaps the most influential vehicle for the promotion of California modernism was a California design exhibition held from 1954 to 1976. There were 8 annuals, 3 triennials, and a bicentennial. The California Design Show was instrumental in making the state a recognized player in design and focused on objects from home furnishings to decorative accessories to consumer goods. And when Eudora Moore, who believed that California was, quote, an incubator for contemporary design, became director in 1962, she instituted a jury system and expanded the shows. My parents had the rare distinction of being included in every California design exhibition with more than 60 objects, underscoring their importance of the contributions to California modernism. So while many of their peers became known for working in one medium or style, my parents' creative expression was multifaceted, broad, and diverse. They had no formal art training exposure until college. That's where my mom discovered Rembrandt, Cezanne, Klee, German Expressionists, and Matisse in her art history classes. That's where my father was influenced by Chinese pottery and the work of Shoji Hamada and Bernard Leach in his ceramics class with John Foster. And thanks to their fine art background, they had a very sophisticated sensibility that informed their designs. The artistic vision and versatile expression was enhanced by a wide spectrum of references to art across cultures and time periods. They were also adept at keeping up with the trends, shifting their palette and exploring new artistic directions as they emerged. The California lifestyle they embraced was strongly reflected in their design aesthetic and articulated in pieces with a hand-wrought sensibility that were organic, warm, textural, and colorful. For their initial ceramic venture in Jenev, my father found that hand-throwing individual pieces was not scalable. He couldn't make a living unless he was also teaching like many ceramists of the time. So instead, he created a group of slip-cast ceramics, which were functional objects that had sensual forms. This process involves pouring slip or liquid clay into a mold created from a hand-carved master and a model. The multi-part plaster molds had to be held closed while the slip dried and adhered to the walls. My father actually cut strips of inner tubes as heavy-duty rubber bands. Once the piece was removed from the mold, it had to be cleaned up, and then it had to dry, and then the stoner would be bisque fired, and then dipped in glaze, and then glaze fired. So even though it was a production process, there was still a tremendous amount of handwork. But then they saw a mosaic exhibit in San Francisco in the mid-50s, and my parents were like, well, let's try mosaics. So they started with a line of tables, and then they added wall panels and custom installations. The picture of my mom with the scaffolding, that is still in situ in Los Angeles. It's been there since 1956. It's on the side of an apartment building designed by Cheryl Brody. And my mother made that piece in 3 segments in their studio. It's 21 feet high. And when they did their next special commission mosaic, my mom said, we're making it in Mexico. So as the business became ERA, they realized they could not keep up with demand by making everything themselves. So following the Bauhaus philosophy that art and industry were not mutually exclusive, they worked with a family of skilled mosaic artisans in Mexico City to execute their designs. Their design output grew to include textiles and other materials, and so they sourced other craftspeople around the globe to make their products. And remember, letters and phone, trade journals, trade consulates, no sending an email. So they also pursued very limited production runs, which meant they could maintain high quality and keep their products affordable and add new designs in a flexible way. Their knowledge of traditional craft techniques helped them work with craftsmen in Italy, Japan, Mexico, Greece, and India. My mother hated flying. So despite this global network, they went to Mexico once in 1957, and that was it. So my mother would start with a small tissue paper concept for a mosaic. And once they decided to move forward with a design, she would create a full-size template with instructions and color keys that were mailed to the artisans. The full-size template was chalked on the back, and then it would be traced onto a masonite board. The tiles were cut to fit the shapes and glued to the backing. Now, to be more efficient, they generally designed to standardized sizes. 18-inch squares or rounds, or a 12 by 36 by 48 by 60. But what that also meant in terms of efficiency was my mom had to design compositions that worked within the size constraints. The process of cutting the tile, which was tesserae, to fit these designs was very labor intensive. It took a day to produce 1 square foot of mosaic. So my parents took to different mediums and styles with ease. What unites everything is their unerring eye for quality and craftsmanship. They employed an innovative combination of traditional techniques and modern production approaches. And because they understood the materials, they were able to adapt individual designs across media, resulting in cross-disciplinary approach that was really unusual for designer craftsmen of the time. So my mother's 12 signs of the zodiac were issued first as multicolor mosaics, and then a 2-color silk screen, and then they tried bas-relief wood carvings. So you can see her ability to work across medium, color, and dimension. With a keen eye for color, pattern, line, and proportion, my mother moved easily from geometric minimalism to biomorphic abstraction to whimsical stylization, creating designs adaptable to commercial and residential applications. They stayed true to their goal to produce commercially viable pieces that were well designed, accessible, and, as mentioned, affordable. Now, my father was still primarily focused on the business kind of CEO, COO aspects of ERA, but he did still design occasionally. These more graphic geometric pieces, an autumn abstract hooking, and an aerial view tapestry are his concepts refined for line and color with my mom's input. Aerial view actually was recently acquired by the Milwaukee Art Museum. My mother took one weaving class in college while she was still at the University of Michigan. And soon after introducing mosaics, they decided, let's add hand-woven tapestries and silkscreens. They found a family of skilled serape weavers outside of Mexico City to execute the tapestries. Needless to say, the designs and colors were not what the weavers were used to. Now, my mother was a very gifted illustrator, and so everything was hand-drawn with colored pencils and tissue paper, and she'd start with the concept and potential color palettes. This cat and bird tapestry from 1962 is 23 by 45 inches high, but the drawing is about 8 inches high. And she's got some instructions on it as well. Now, same with the mosaic, she would create a full-size template, enlarging a small drawing. She'd project it on the wall in our studio. And the templates were then accompanied by detailed instructions and small drawings with color legends, like a paint by number concept, and keyed to the yarns. The sample was sent for review, and once my parents approved the design, it was produced. Now, because everything was handmade, no pieces are identical. And the size of the woven tapestries was restricted not by frames and masonite backings, but by the size of the loom. And so the bigger the piece, because it cost by the square meter of wool, the more expensive it was. The biggest pieces they ever produced were 44 by 70 inches. And that only happened in 1970, before they were limited to much smaller looms. Then my parents thought, well, let's design and sell rugs. But there was a lot of competition, and large rugs required a large warehouse, which they did not have. So they leveraged hand hooking, and they went to find a source for that technique and discovered it in Japan, who at the time was still recovering from the war, but had a tremendous handcraft industry. And here are again detailed drawings of this particular design, girl with birdcage and girl with flowers. I have to say sometimes their naming was not all that creative, but you get the idea. Here's a warm and cool colorway, right? So my mother employed different levels of pile, which was something you could do in a hooking, which you can't do in a flat weave, as Kip would know. And she would retain some looped areas, have some other areas cut, some higher, some lower, and it gave elevation and dimensionality to a piece. I had this hooking. This is actually my tapestry from my childhood in 1962. It's called Garden, and it hung over my bed. And one day my dad came home with a Playboy magazine, which he had never done before. And he said, look at this cartoon by John Dempsey. And his wry observation was, you know, you've really made it when you're in Playboy. So one of my mother's hallmarks was her keen eye for color. Her and my father realized that you could make use of one design and offer it in multiple colorways. You had more to sell. And more importantly, it went with different color schemes that people were doing in their houses at the time. So they got tremendous flexibility, scalability out of this approach. Here's a canal tapestry. You can see she's used this abstracted geometry of the buildings to play with the pattern and the color, and the two read completely differently. Or here in a 12 by 60 inch mosaic called Pennants, you can see that the texture even seems different because of the coloration in the pieces. So my parents were constantly experimenting with materials, and because they were able to translate imagery from one medium to another, the same design could be adapted to a textile or a metal or wood or even hydrogen in a few cases. And that maximized the development investment and broadened the design's appeal and usability. So designed in 1959, Flower Garden was available as a mosaic and a larger version in a hand-woven tapestry. They have the same cheerful color palette, but there's a difference in size and texture and technique here. And the tapestry, because you could read either side, I flipped it so you could see how the design looks. The mosaic, obviously, you couldn't turn around, but it's kind of interesting. So then they determined that there wasn't enough good hardware cabinet out there because they didn't have enough to do. And they turned their design eye to this. These cabinet pieces were hand cast in solid brass in Italy, and they came with a variety of inlays and finishes. It took multiple artisans to produce the hardware. One did the brass casting, one did mosaic inlay, another did stone, another did patinas. The Antico line that my father designed in 1965 was hand cast in brass and offered in a variety of finishes. And he used to say the only thing that's not hand worked are the screw holes. This horse door pull is one of my favorites. We put it on the cover of the book. It's from 1959. You could use it as a wall decoration. They're about 6 by 10. Or you could use a pair to make a really sculptural, dramatic entry statement on a door. They came in turquoise, lapis, this vermilion color, a black with mother of pearl. So there was a wide variety of finishes available. So now I want to talk a little bit about process with wood. This design curiosity that they had led them also in 1957 to try wood carving, bas-reliefs. My father had this knack for adapting industrial techniques to products. And in the case of wood carvings, he employed multiple spindle machineries like a pantograph. It was used for making furniture. He found a British furniture maker in Southern California. These designs were completely unrelated to what he was doing, but he was very intrigued. My mother would create a drawing that included elevations and texture instructions for the carver who would make a hand-carved master. Now, they stuck with the British guy for a few years, and then they needed a bigger plant, so they moved, but stayed in Southern California. And this Flor de Madera represents the kind of level of detail in those instructions. And actually, I find the drawing itself quite beautiful, but those colors are not decorative. They are the height down from the surface of the wood. So white is the top surface of the panel. Pink goes down 1 level, darker pink goes down 2, magenta is 3, and black is the deepest cut of all. She gives all these informational instructions. Keep the cost under $3. Leave all the tool marks. Have a sculptural effect and radius. She's thinking 3-dimensionally when she's thinking about this versus when she's thinking about a tapestry. Once approved, the master was placed in the center of this multiple spindle machine. The design was roughed out on the flat boards. And so even though they're quasi-mass produced in this way, following the contours of the master, they all were individually finished by hand. And so that results in slight variations, resulting in pieces that are similar, but not identical, and they still have a hand-produced aesthetic. So with Cheryl Brody, who I mentioned, he was an architect. He was a high school friend of my dad's. They established Panel Carve in 1963. Cheryl eventually bought it out, and it became a company called Forms and Surfaces. My father leveraged the idea of tongue and groove to create a series of modular wood panels. The idea was they would marry and create a surface that didn't reveal that they were separate pieces, but that almost like it was all of one piece. And also because many of the pieces were 9 by 36, you could configure them easily and in any way you wanted on architectural installations, a door, furniture, counters, all sorts of things. This first design, Uccello, my mom produced in about a week, and it was featured actually in the 1964 World's Fair. The Allen Ladd building, this is a photo from about the early 70s, doesn't look like this anymore. It's called something else, and only the upper transom still exists. But if you're in Palm Springs, you can see this on Palm Canyon Drive. There are still numerous installations of Panel Carve that you can see. And as architectural people, I am sure there are some in Minnesota. Here, this is a castles design at the UCLA Faculty Center and a residential door in Los Angeles. So they were careful not to compromise their aesthetics, but they also had to respond to market needs. So every 6 months, there's a trade show. What are they going to do? Well, in 1971, Macy's opened a concept called the cellar, gourmet food, gourmet wares. And they leveraged this opportunity in a retail market they already had entree into. And my mother designed a series of like 30 some odd small carved wood plaques that my father then turned his product development brain to and created knife holders and other kitchen accessories made in ash. They also used the same plaques made in redwood so that they could put them outside as plant holders. So again, multiple uses for one design to make it efficient. By the early 80s, remember my parents were born in the 20s, my parents cut back on making new products. My father continued to represent several other lines and work with architects and interior designers. As a matter of fact, he spec'd the floor in a big chunk of the Getty Center. So kind of funny because he already had all these relationships. But primarily they refocused their creative energies on their individual studio practice. My mother had taken an enameling class decades before, and in 1984, she spent a year and a half creating a 40-piece cloisonne series called Stories from the Bible. They are 3 1/8 inches square, and they're now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in the Renwick Gallery. When I was little, my mom made a dollhouse for me, and that led to her into a love of antique toys and dolls. And she became a respected expert in that area. She wrote hundreds of articles, 5 books. She volunteered at the costume and textile department at the LA County Art Museum. So they found this whole other world of things that interested them. My father went back to his first love and the tactile quality of clay after a 30-year hiatus. In fact, growing up, I never saw my dad throw a pot. He was still a traditional potter, but now he introduced these more whimsical decorative elements. He showed in galleries, he sold his pieces, and he also has ceramics that are in the Smithsonian and other museums. So I grew up in this eclectic home curated by my parents, filled with art and mid-century furniture, quite literally growing up in their business. But it took me years to realize the significance of their contributions. I think like other celebrated post-war design couples, if you look at Ray and Charles Eames, Robin and Lucian Day, Joseph and Annie Albers, Massimo and Leila Vignelli, they continue to influence design today. Their curiosity about materials, the global elan of their designs, the expansiveness of their artistic talent, and the tenacity they brought to their work fuel my passion as the steward of an enduring legacy that still resonates today. So how am I promoting and extending this legacy? Well, perhaps the most important part of ensuring it means doing things like talking to you today, finding ways to share their story and make their designs accessible again. So I steward their work through collections, exhibitions, programs, publications, licensing, and scholarships. So harnessing my parents' artistic vernacular to reinterpret the past and forge a future is part of how I'm bringing my parents' designs to a new audience. In 2017, I partnered with Design Within Reach to reissue a collection of my dad's Jenev ceramics. We used the originals to develop production molds and glazes, which he said we couldn't reproduce because they would kill people, to stay true to the artistic vision of the designs. We did that for 5 years. It was wonderful. And then in 2023, I started a collaboration with CB2, which is a branch of Crate and Barrel. The Ackermans are part of the Design Legends series, along with Paul McCobb, who brought their first ceramics to a national audience. So it's like full circle. I like to think of it as traditional technique meeting modern style. Many of the pieces for CB2 are handmade. I work with the development team and we reference photos, original drawings, and vintage pieces. In some cases, we've reproduced the work exactly as it was. And in others, like in this case, we've reimagined the design in my parents' spirit of experimentation. This appetizer plate uses this horse design from a 1965 tapestry called Stallion. We named it Corvo after a woman who was one of the original weavers. So my parents have works in all sorts of museums. I won't labor over all of their names, but I think it's rewarding for me to know that their design talent and entrepreneurial spirit has really inspired others. That movie was made in 2014, so that's 10 years ago, where Jonathan Adler was talking about my parents. And he said to me once, their work is the perfect marriage of gorgeous design, impeccable craftsmanship, and emotional sincerity. I wanted to have a craft-based design career that also paid the bills, and they showed me that these two things were not exclusive. Trina Turk, the fashion designer, loves my parents, so it's really interesting to see how their legacy lives on. This image is from the LA County Art Museum, found in translation. There's a launchpad tapestry and an ellipses mosaic. The ellipses happens to be in their collection, and I think they would like to have the launchpad eventually. I've also wanted to pay it forward to students, which I think is so appropriate being here at a university. I actually, in 2020, endowed the Evelyn and Jerome Ackerman Scholarship at Wayne State University for undergraduate art students, and the Jerome Ackerman internship at the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum for art or art history students in ceramics. And those have now had multiple recipients, which has really been fantastic. I wish my parents had been here to see it. So 2025 is kind of a special year for me. Actually, 2024 might have been better. It was my mom's centennial, but we'll take it. And I'm really thrilled that Minneapolis is the first place to get a look at this new book we did. And this Friday, Arn Company New York opens an exhibition called Piece by Piece, The Mosaics of Evelyn Ackerman. And it runs through August 15th. So if you happen to go to New York, go see it. The Cranbrook Museum, for all of you mid-century folks, eventually everything connects mid-century modern design in the US, opens September 14th. No, I'm sorry, June 14th, and runs through September 21st. And so they'll be drawing on their extensive collection and pieces from the Henry Ford and other collectors. And then on September 27th in Los Angeles, we have a show called Material Curiosity by Design, Evelyn and Jerome Ackerman, Mid-Century Modern to Today at the Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles. So I want to thank you all. I'm sure I've run over the time allotted and tried to talk fast. And I really appreciate your attention. So I don't know, Amy, Stephen, Peter, Aiden, do you guys want to do questions? What's the next thing? Oh, I know, there's another slide. There are Docomomo slides here. So does somebody want to come up and talk about those?
I think we're going to do questions and answers for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
If we have time. Yeah. Anybody? Build the one slide where Matt Kahn did the interior design of the Eichler House.
Yes.
You know Matt Kahn? Your parents have a relationship with Matt Kahn?
I went to Stanford, so I didn't realize my parents knew Matt Kahn until they said, oh, Matt Kahn, Nathan Olivero. Yeah. And when we bought our house, which is in Eichler in 1987, my parents said, oh, Joe would be rolling over in his grave if he knew what you paid for that house.
Matt Kahn goes in the Eichler House too, but Quincy Jones.
Yes.
Created one of the buildings your parents had an office in, or?
He did a lot of interior design for Joe Eichler, and so he used my parents' pieces all the time. And actually, Joe Eichler had said to my parents, because they thought about moving to Palo Alto originally, and they said, but what are we going to do to make a living? And he said, well, I'll just sell a pot to everybody who buys a house.
I'll talk to you more later.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I can't believe somebody actually knew who Matt Kahn was.
So the questions, that the mic isn't working.
Do I need to say that?
You need to repeat it.
Okay, so the question, I'm sorry, so now I know. The question was if my parents knew Matt Kahn personally, and yes, they did.
Anyone else?
About the character of their relationship as a couple, and the character of those relationships of other design couples, and in particular, what influence was there with any cross-pollination that might have happened as a result of those couples knowing or being friends with each other?
So the question is about other design couples and any cross-pollination my parents might have had with them in their work and their relationships. The Eames were older. They went to Cranbrook. My parents couldn't afford Cranbrook. It was private and too expensive for them. So the Aerosarinins and the Eames and those guys were all, maybe a decade ahead of them. They did know the Eames. I know the grandchildren of the Eames. They were in this milieu where everybody interconnected in this small community, but people like the American Ceramic Society were much more specialized. So, and most of the ceramists taught because they couldn't make a living without teaching. So there were places like Claremont or like Millard Sheets, who you may know, also taught, as well as doing these architectural and mural installations. So my parents basically felt that they did their own thing, but they absorbed everything that was around them. And whether it was African tribal art, or it was European furniture, or it was early primitive figures or something classical, it all kind of entered their vocabulary. I think more what happened for them, because so many people did come to LA, but they started coming in the 30s and 40s. My parents didn't come till the 50s. They knew like Jerry Kavanaugh, who was a textile designer, and Bernie Castor, who taught at UCLA, and all these other people. So they were involved with them, but they did their own thing, if that makes sense. And I think it was a very loose-knit community of artists, but it was always wonderful to go to exhibitions with my parents where, somebody like Harry McIntosh, you got to see him. He was 99 years old the last time I saw him, and my parents went to go see Harry because he had a ceramic exhibition. So these ties were very important to them. But I think ultimately most of the people in this arena didn't do what my parents did. They either had a big company behind them. They had Knoll, they had Herman Miller, they had architectural pottery. Rita and Max Lawrence were very good friends of my parents. So they did like John Follis and Rex Good, their designs. But there was this company. My parents had their own company doing their own thing. And in that way, I think they really were different from other people. And my dad used to say it was a trial marriage. Because I think they really did sometimes wonder how they managed to work and live together all those years.
Okay, right. Do you know any specifics on the sources of the pigments that were used at the beginning of their tapestry kind of time period? Because some of those pigments are so like striking and stand out in that way from other pieces kind of at the same time. So if you don't know, that's fine.
So the question was, do I know anything about the background of the pigments that were used in the dyes on the textiles? I can tell you that actually they generally brought in dyes from Germany because the serape weavers had more natural dyes. There's a gentleman named Porfirio Gutierrez who you had out recently, I think at the Textile Center. He does all natural traditional dye work, which is incredible. My parents had to worry about a couple of things: consistency of color and color fastness. And actually, if you see sometimes my parents' pieces up on like eBay or whatever, they'll be really faded on the front and totally saturated on the back because they're light sensitive. So the German dyes allowed them to get these bright, vibrant colors, these pinks, the magentas, the blues, the oranges. The tesserae tiles, like for the mosaics, those are actually generally were the Venetian kind of tiles, and they were ordered through Mexican merchants. So they would work with the colors that were available for the mosaics, and they would work with the yarns that were available. There was a company called Toyo in Japan, and they would key the hookings to the Toyo colors for the yarns because the Japanese did their own dyeing. So the weavers in Mexico would dye, but my parents brought in the actual material for the dyeing. Does that answer your question? Anybody else?
Can I do a follow-up?
Sure.
My alma mater is RIT, and when you spoke about education, and I saw a picture of Peter Volkos there. I'm wondering if they had any interaction with the School of American Craft. With the School of American Craft, or RIT.
So the question is, the gentleman is an alumni of RIT, and he was curious if my parents had any interaction with the School of Craft at RIT, and because of Peter Volkos's relationship. It's possible, but I can tell you I cannot speak to that 100% for sure. I know that they were in like the Syracuse exhibitions. They were in the Kiln Club out of Washington, DC exhibition. So they exhibited nationally, like at the Walker. So there was some interaction, but it's not like they flew out to these shows, right? They submitted a photograph or the actual piece. They had pieces in Craft in a Changing World at the what is now the Museum of Craft and Design, and the Museum of Art and Design in New York. So there is some level of, they would see other people's pieces. They knew other people, Rupert Dees, Carlton Ball, all these people, they were all working at the same time. But, my parents were busy working and making a living. So they weren't as much engaged in going out and meeting people unless they're cross paths at like a show.
They didn't generally do lectures or presentations, but
They didn't do any lectures or presentations. And, trips were occasionally to Chicago or occasionally to Detroit. I never went to New York with my parents. They went up to San Francisco. My dad did sales trips. That was about it. So he was constantly in architect's office. So I would say there would be a lot more interaction between my dad and well-known architects and interior designers of the time where he knew everybody. It was kind of amazing. So I'll start over here and then we'll work our way across.
I'm just curious, because they were so interdisciplinary, were there ever media that they explored that didn't end up in production?
Were there any other designs that,
Like media that they.
oh,
Yeah.
so the question is, they were so interdisciplinary, were there other designs that wound up in other media? They did do some of their pieces in metal. You'll see, I didn't put up in any of these slides, sorry. There's a warrior concept. It feels very sort of, I don't know, medieval Romanesque. They did it in a metal cast aluminum plaque. My mother also did it as a mosaic that she did herself, but it was too expensive the way she did it. So then they simplified the form. It wound up in an applique and a raffia design. So she would play with a design and adapt it to the media, but the same sort of general approach often held across. And sometimes they'd experiment with something and they decided it was not going to work, so they just didn't produce it. All right, there was somebody over here.
Great examples of how like one design would be transformed in different ways, with different colors or different. Did they ever did they do the same colors and the same scheme and have many of them reproduced ever, or was each piece individual? You know what I mean? Like to what degree? I know you said that because it was hand done with the original, but like about how many of one particular like color scheme would be produced? Does that make sense?
Yes. So the question is, if they did different color schemes across different products, how many of those would they produce, and did they change color schemes? So I will say, I didn't show anything here, but there was a period of time they did earth tones. Hello, 1970s. And there's a design called Moonscape that my mom originally did in yellow and orange and hot magenta, but it's also in black and brown and tan. But generally what happened was once they arrived on a color scheme, that was pretty well set. So if it was cool tones or warm tones, that they would follow those same colors. That does not mean that the people producing the work always did. So sometimes you'll see a piece like a mosaic where maybe they ran out of that color green, so they used a different color green. Maybe they decided that just plain blue was kind of boring there, so they did blue and black. So there's this variation, the craftsmanship of the touch of an individual's hand who's looking at it and getting a little creative on the side sometimes, but in general, if you ordered a hot summer landscape that was bright pink and blue and vermilion, that is what you got all the way across. And my parents were very careful about keeping a level of standards because they had catalog pages. And as they got more products, they were in color, and you had to, if somebody was ordering, if Bullock's was ordering for their department store, or Langdon and, Wilson and Langdon was ordering for a job, if that picture was those colors, then you had to have a product that was those colors. So one more question?
Yeah.
It's Kip.
Hi.
Are you going to be the finale?
I-
Kip's got a beautiful weaving out there inspired by my mom's mosaic, by the way. You have to look at it.
So I'm curious, given kind of you know, how deep that you're steeped in your parents' process and vision and innovation and exploration and all those things. What do you see as opportunities moving forward for this same kind of inspiration and exploration in kind of the current milieu of art and digital and AI and all those things that we often kind of are afraid of? But is there something from your parents' experience that might guide artists kind of moving into kind of the world today?
So the question is, being so steeped in my parents' design process, do I see opportunities in the world today and moving forward, whether it's through digital design or some other means of either bringing their designs or for artists working on their own careers, what to do about that? And I would say, you know, I was talking to, I think an adjunct professor, Nikolai, who came through, he does web design. He goes, oh, but it's, you know, it's just web. And I'm like, well, no, because if you do web, then you have to understand topography and color and composition. And good design is good design, right? So people who think because they have a computer background that they can become a web designer or that they can do digital photography or AI. I have this vision of my mother. They once went to an MFA exhibition and my mom came home and said to me, I don't understand how an ice cube melting in a bowl is art. Right. But, you know, everybody envisions things differently. I think people really, you know, I think people still value handcraft. I think people still value things that are made by a human touch. That said, it's more expensive. So this sort of quasi industrial production model my parents adopted was a great bridge between mass production. I mean, the Eames pieces are mass produced. That doesn't take away from the fact that they're incredible designs. Plywood and fiberglass, which came out of World War II products, and you see like pictures of their splint for that, you know, for people who were injured. These processes led to a modernization concept. And I think we are in another era of that, except that it's so digitally enhanced. You know, the Eames probably would have come up with their same incredible concepts working on a computer as working with a hand drawing. So I think of computer technology and digital technology more as a tool than I do as an end product, right? You can draw on a computer, you can do photography, you can design things, you can look at three-dimensionality, you can do CAD. So I think that there are more opportunities for designers. But that said, the downside is, and I do a lot of infringement chasing, is people copy and people steal and people don't honor the designer or the artisan who made the piece. And so lots of things that are older are not copyright protected. They were sunsetted and if they weren't renewed. And so it's, I think, a real challenge for me in particular, because something will pop up and I'll go, really? You're putting a mosaic on Etsy and it's like a reproduction of my mother's, and then I have to write letters and then they pull it down for a week and then it goes back up. So occasionally we get somewhere, but I think it's a challenge with today's technology and the ease of, shall we call it, borrowing rather than licensing. And that's why I'm so proactive about working with licensing and being part of the design process when I work with a company like CB2, so that they aren't, I understand they want a color palette that fits their brand identity, that we can play with things, but there is a level of fidelity to the original work and concept. That's very important to me. Thank you. Those were great questions. I hope I answered them well. All right, so. Oh, that was the thank you slide. Sorry. Thank you.